The child welfare system is an industrial complex. It's a multi-billion-dollar industrial complex. And in certain circumstances, I could probably even push it to a trillion-dollar industrial complex. The system is designed for the acquisition of goods. Children had always been considered as chattel. People look at the Constitution and say children are not included in it, but actually they are. It's called posterity. The posterity of a nation, the future. That's where the laws of perpetuity kick in. The laws of perpetuity are applied to property. That property of the chattel, of being a movable good, it's not the child itself, it is the birth certificate, the title of the good. Because who is ever in possession of that title has the rights to benefit from the future perpetuities of that good. It is at that time that it is an admission of guilt for failure to provide for the necessary means of the child. That is a legal codification of poverty, which is a crime, and the crime is called abuse and neglect. When a father cannot make his child support payments, he has failed to provide for the necessary needs of the child. Now, that child support situation collects arrearages that never cease to accrue, and you can never catch up. And one of the reasons why is because the state can come in and intervene. Because if the child is under the auspices of the state, because the state is a third party to the actual birth of that birth certificate, the certificate is certified by the state. If the parent cannot provide, the state will intervene. And upon that intervention, the parent has, or the original guardian has no rights to challenge. The only rights would be the rights under property law. That's how our nation was built. It was built upon the backs of the weak, the tired, the old, the infirm. It is the oldest model to rebuild a society, and that's what's been going on right now. So, in regards to the child welfare system and the money is this. Everyone says, oh, we shouldn't have entitlements. We shouldn't assist people who are in need no matter what the situation is. But people fail to understand that this is a whole propaganda campaign. It's because people don't grow up wanting to be poor. The state is coming in and intervening and removing the children. But what people don't understand is if you're saying that you're poor and I shouldn't help you get back on your feet, I'm going to take your child. Let's talk about the money. Once that child is put under the auspices of the state and what most people know as foster care, because Child Protective Services is the enforcement that acquires the good, removes that child, and the legal properties of that child, being the birth certificate eventually, and puts it as a ward of the court or a ward of the state. That is a judicial determination at which point the federal funding stream spigots open and money comes flowing down like you wouldn't believe. Once the child goes into these child placing agencies, which is a layer of administration within the child welfare system that I wholeheartedly believe needs to be eliminated, and it needs to be direct service providing from the state to the individual. These child placing agencies, which are nonprofit, are never audited. The state cannot come in and audit. It's an honor system of reporting. And these child placing agencies will come up and say, we've had 0 error ratings. I was taught well that whenever you see a system with a 0 error rating, there's fraud contained within that system, because that is not a true system. Any social system has an error rating. So these child placement agencies then in turn are receiving taxpayer money to put on big advertising campaigns during the month of April, which is Child Abuse Prevention Month. You have Foster Care Awareness Month, May. Foster Parent Month in May. You have Adoption Month in May. And if you look statistically, because I do stochastic analysis on the expenditures and I look at court systems, how much money you can see a pattern. Whenever these months, you have spikes of the number of children who go into the child welfare system. The next level of layering to foster care being Title IV-E, and there is a set payment rate. But what they do is they accelerate the payment rate by classifying a child as special needs. A child is classified as special needs under the categories of being a minority, being in a sibling group, yes, having any kind of medical issues. A child can be taken from a parent because of lack of medical coverage, because the state will only cover in instances of mental health, only through voluntary placement into a child abuse case. That's how you get help for your child. And the numbers statistically get crunched, sent up through SACWIS, get pumped out to show, look at all these neglected children. No, they're not neglected. The parents just didn't qualify for health insurance. I'm talking children as young as 6 months old, cocktails of psychotropic medicine that have not been approved by the FDA for usage in children. And they dope these kids up because Medicaid pays for it. And there is no way to challenge the Medicaid cost reimbursements because the state attorney general has contained within his unit, it's called the State Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. That is certified by the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That unit is supposed to go after Medicaid fraud. The state attorney general cannot go after Medicaid fraud and child welfare because the state attorney general is the one who prosecutes child welfare and is also the one who defends the contractual relationships of the child placement agencies. So you have an inherent conflict of interest where not one state attorney general has gone after Medicaid fraud and child welfare. Another area of Medicaid fraud and child welfare is targeted case management. Targeted case management is what is a cost reimbursement for these programs. A lot of the programs are phantom programs. They don't exist. And then you have unnecessary services, improper services, non-existent services. You have people who double bill, triple bill. You have people, I call them kitty kickbacks. Kitty kickbacks under, actually, if you look at a lot of the fraud statutes, it comes, in the whole realm of antitrust. Basically, a little scheme of that is the child placement agency has a contract with perhaps a therapist. The therapist says, I'm going to advocate for termination of parental rights. You make sure you keep sending contracts to me for kids so I can keep my business going. And they financially get kickbacks. There is no way for this to be examined or audited. It has never been done. You cannot do that. So you have another layer of fraud. Another layer of fraud which was uncovered in Wayne County by the former Auditor General of Wayne County. What he uncovered was that they were running double cases, phantom cases. So you would have a child go into the child welfare system under this court case, but they were running rubber stamping fake cases under juvenile delinquents. So now you have cases, once again, children as young as 2 months old being processed through the juvenile justice system for crimes they never committed, because they were double billing. They would take it's called the Will Smith, Bill Smith syndrome, where you have Will Smith with this social security number, you cut and paste, flip it over here in the juvenile justice, you change Will to Bill. And now the same social security number, but they're called double jackets, so nobody knows what's going on. Then you have another layer of fraud, where you have individuals, particularly individuals running for public office, and a lot of them are judges, because Maura Corrigan, when she sat on the Pew Commission, for foster care. She advocated judicial activism. So now you have judges who sit on the boards of these child placement agencies who come in front of that same judge for hearings. So now how is the average individual, how is an individual supposed to receive due process in a court when the judge is going to rule in favor of that child placement agency of which they sit on the board and of which they receive financial contributions to their reelection campaigns? We don't know. So the level of fraud we're talking about billions per state. I don't just say this because it's fun. I collect state auditor general reports, and I collect the inspector general reports of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And these reports come out, and they look at every level of the child welfare system. You can look, for example, Maximus. Maximus is one of the, you might remember Lockheed Martin being in charge of the Title 4D child support program. And well, anyway, the contract was split up, renamed. Maximus took over a lot of the electronic benefit transfers for the states. Well, in one area, there were undisclosed funds. So in Title 4D, the child support program, Maximus was collecting child support but was not distributing the child support because they were sitting on it collecting interest. And the ratio for the states is approximately $4 for every dollar they collect. So there's almost $4 through administration fees for every dollar they collect for an individual. Now, beyond the audit reports that are demonstrating through sample audits, just samples, small samples, they're documenting hundreds of millions of dollars a year from a state, from a certain segment of a child welfare program. Let's take it one further. There are some brave attorneys who have filed False Claims Act under seal that I've been privileged to review and actually consult in some of their cases. And it is unbelievable what they do to human beings, mainly children in these systems. These residential facilities are functioning off of a model that goes back to the turn of the century. And these residential facilities they're basically mini prisons of which they can build. There's no supervision. The violence that goes on, the suicides are not even reported in these facilities. They mark it off as a general death or a medical death. There's suicides. There are rapes. I'm not going to water it down, that go on in these facilities. They're horrific. There's no reason for a lot of these youth to be in contained environments when we could put them right back in the community, right back to their original guardians by just giving them a few little trinkets of assistance to make life stable to go forth. But instead of doing that, we prefer to drop approximately $300,000 a year on one child who is in a residential facility on the highest level of medications classified as special needs under mental health, plus with the special education components. So that's an area that we really need to look at, but nobody will look at it because it's under what I call the iron curtain of secrecy. You cannot look at this, you cannot audit it. The only thing that we know are the propaganda campaigns that come out. They have a little TV picture of a little child crying because they've been hit. That's not what the real story is. There are anomalies or unique cases that happen that are extremely tragic, that do deserve intervention of the system, but the way that we systematically harvest youth has got to stop, because right now they're designing these youth in the system where they're aging out at the age of 18. They've just passed laws in certain states where they're keeping them to the age of 21, but they're not helping them much anymore. Still, at the age of 21 or 18, whatever you want to call it, with a garbage bag in your hand, you are dumped on the streets. That is what the state does to the children that they come in to save. These youth end up no education because they've been transferred to home to home to home. They've never had a stable education, so they don't acquire high school diplomas. They can't learn. They've been, the sexual abuses that go on during their whole time, they've been under the auspices of the state are horrific. The state will not report them. So now you have an individual who's violent, who's scared. It's a survival mechanism, no education, and they're on the street. I have consistently argued that we do not base our prison bed population on fourth grade MEP scores. We base them on our foster care population because the prison system is an industry also which is included within the child welfare system. We do not calculate that. We used to count our youth, even from the beginning of the time, we used to count our youth as future soldiers. You can go back to any society, the Greeks, the Romans, they would always count. We count our youth based upon the prison system because it is a multi-billion-dollar industrial complex which falls under child welfare. Child welfare, just to let you know as an example how powerful this segment is, when they did the raids down in Waco, Texas, years ago, when Janet Reno was in charge, the way they got authority to raid those camps was under child welfare in the best interest of the children. It was an exigent circumstance. Therefore, all rules are thrown out the window. You can do whatever you want. But because they're nonprofits, they cannot be audited. Now, on the other side of that, let's talk about what efforts are being made. I've been working with the Department of Justice for the last year. I was in Washington, D.C. last year. There were 6 cities that were targeted to look at youth violence prevention. And what they want to do is they want to change the entire language of child abuse. They want to call it violence prevention. They want a large realm of violence prevention. And instead of removing the child, they're looking at removing the factors that cause it to happen so that it may never happen again, such as, I rambled off the list earlier, decent education, housing, nutrition, transportation, access to jobs. That's another major one. So the youth violence prevention, which is an initiative of all the cabinets within the executive branch, have done a collaboration, and they're looking to come together with a solution. How can we stop this? How can we make sure that we have in the future an educated, productive workforce, innovative, creative talent, so that we don't have to import our intellectual resources? So what they're doing is they're looking into it. And they just had a series where Detroit was the last city to have the testimonies. And they had testimonies of what Attorney General Holder, his initiative is called Defending Childhood. And what he's looking at is he's looking at the system as it stands. The money, the violence, the destruction of childhood. And I was very grateful and honored to be a part of these testimonies because these stories were raw. These were stories that have never seen the light of day because no one will allow people to speak upon this matter. So the report is supposed to be out sometime the end of July, beginning of August, and we're going to see what really goes on in the system. And the reason why Attorney General Holder, I believe, is the right person for this is because back in the 80s, there was a case out of New York when he was a United States attorney, and it's called the Disintegration settlement, where he facilitated the settlement with the city of New York because New York was engaging in contractual fraud in these child welfare programs. So now we have taken that to another level of basically antitrust violations. There is no competition in child welfare services. Basically, you have the establishment of a few agencies, or whatever you want to call it. There is no competition of prices. They set their prices. They will tell you how much. These people come together at tables and they bid on cases. Who's going to get which child? Which child's going to pay the most money? And then they go with these lists and they go pick them up. So a lot of these agencies and their contractual arrangements, you have a lot of false claims. You have inflation. Because there's no competition, there's inflation on the prices, which is hurting the taxpayer. We have to pay for their enjoyment of destroying a childhood. That's something we need to question desperately. Then you have the area of training. Training for what? Some of these training programs, they bill millions of dollars for. I've gone to some of these training programs. I do this for enjoyment. And I sit there and observe people printing off the internet items from other states. I've seen them bill for Dr. Phil shows. This is called training? There needs to be some accountability. The fault lies upon the administrators of the federal and state programs. These administrators have been there from day one and refuse to leave the helm. This is one of the reasons why I decided it's time. I stood up and I went forth to run. Because the administrators stay. The elected leave over and over. Every 2 years there's a new cycle, particularly in Michigan. But the administration stays. And they're the ones that write the policies, that tells the legislator what to do. Because they're just a new person coming up, they don't know what to do. These administrators are the ones that are giving their friends contracts. They go in and out of federal to state. Federal to state, that's what they do. We have lobbying disclosure laws and certain laws that if you're a lobbyist, so many years you cannot work for a governmental entity, not in child welfare, because they don't have lobbyists. They're called child placing agencies. And a lot of these agencies or organizations fall under religious organizations, faith-based. Nobody questions faith-based but me, because they are the most egregious ones. Because as soon as you ask to look at their books, they're going to start throwing up in the name of God. No, I want to see your books. One thing I want to bring to your attention is what I like to call double dipping. And double dipping is this. Double dipping is when the state intervenes and removes the child. Many times it doesn't necessarily have to physically be from the home, but in general sense it is. They remove the child and place the child in a different living situation, which will be called foster care. The state then bills for cost reimbursements under Title 4E for the placement of that child. While that child is being reimbursed through a federal program through Social Security, Title 4E, the state turns around and bills the original guardian for child support. Now, if the child was removed because the parent could not provide for the necessary needs of the child, aka being poor, what makes you think that they could pay a child support tab? So the state will bill the original guardian parent for the child support while they're billing the federal government for Title 4E. If that parent pays that child support, does the state reimburse the Title 4E program? No. They keep the money. If that parent, original guardian, cannot afford to pay the child support, that's all the better for the state, because they proceed with termination of parental rights, which leads into the adoption industry. Adoption is a multi-billion-dollar industry because there's bonuses, there's tax incentives. I always tell people when I discuss this subject matter, I said, we don't sell human beings anymore. We give tax incentives. And that's exactly what the adoption subsidies are. So that's a whole nother layer of funding. So in a sense, if you want to capture just a snapshot in time in relation to the finances of child welfare, look at it this way. We could, as a society, help, let's just say, a family whatever the situation is, they're having challenges. We could help them out with $500 a month, or we can take their 2 children and bill at almost $5,000 a month per child. That's the type of math I'm looking at that people need to understand. If you want to look at Title 4B, you want to look at which is the educational component. Title 4B pays for social workers to go to school, to get degrees, to work in the child welfare industry. They pay for education. That's Title 4B. Title 4B also pays for training. Title 4B functions at a 75% federal financial participation rate, where the states kick in 25% and the feds do the 75%. Title 4E is normally at a 50-50 ratio of federal financial participation rates. You look at targeted case management, that's 100% reimbursable. When you keep talking about 66 cents on the dollar, no. Targeted case management is a free-for-all of money coming in. That's it. It's uncapped, unsolicited funding. Sky's the limit. It's ad hoc programming. It's like this. We look at the block grants. We say every year we're going to give a little state, a little chunk of money to take care of their children in their state. The states don't care. It's called outlier payments. It's called after the fact. Okay, we've got them now, let's start billing. And they bill for this, and they keep going on and on. And it's sunken cost. These programs don't work. If they work so well, then why are we having problems with our 70% of our foster care population aging out without high school diplomas, without GEDs, being homeless, going through medication withdrawals because they've been drugged up with psychotropic cocktails for the most of their life, being beaten and physically and emotionally, and they end up on the street, and they end up back within 3-year period of time. They end up back in the institutional system, and this time, as I said before, it's the prison complex. They end up right back in there. If you take studies, Wayne State University did a study. The majority of the people who are homeless on the street came out of foster care. So who's going to hold the state accountable for abuse and neglect? Who's going to hold the state accountable for failing to provide for the necessary needs of the child? Who's going to prosecute the state for children who have died? Look at Ricky Holland. Years ago, Ricky Holland was put in foster care. Was it because his mother beat him or because she abused him? No. His mother voluntarily put him in the system because she was young. I believe she was almost 17 at the time. She was homeless, and she couldn't take the baby to the homeless shelter with her. So they kept saying, give the baby to us. You can get him back when you get on your feet. They refused to give the child back. They ended up terminating her parental rights. The child was then adopted. So to make up for that baby, for the pain of the loss, she had another one. As soon as she gave birth, I always say Steve Yeager was there to cut the umbilical cord. Took the baby, literally, cutting the umbilical cord. Literally, that's not a joke. The state took it. Then she had another one. The state took that baby. So now, the children in the system, little Ricky Holland is underweight, being starved, being beaten in the head with hammers, duct taped, being doped up. I used to have the testimony of the adoptive father who actually told of the scheme that the child placing agency worker and the mother came up with to elevate his medication levels so that they could get more money. This little boy was tortured to death. He used to eat out of garbage cans in school, and if he could escape out the house whenever he can, he would try to eat out the garbage can. They'd tie him to the bed. They put ropes around his neck. Anyway, the child was beaten to death with a hammer. It was horrific. Put in a garbage bag, and they threw him in some out-of-the-woods place. During this time period where the police had these adoptive parents under a murder investigation, the superintendent of Michigan Children's Institute, who is the legal guardian of well over 7,000 children in the state of Michigan, one person, approved the adoption of his 2 siblings. While these people were being investigated for murder, he approved the adoption. Why? Because they like to shred the papers. Once a child's adopted, all the case files are shredded. All the false billing is shredded. Everything is shredded. So finally they found the little boy. They found Ricky Holland. And the murder charges came down. But what was so horrific about that little boy's death was during the time Michigan Office of Children's Ombudsman was about to begin that investigation, they were investigating my case. My case was the largest case of documented federal fraud in the history of the state of Michigan. I shut down a 150-year-old institution, St. Vincent Sarah Fisher Residential Center. Of what they were doing to children in there would make your blood curdle. It was horrific. They were selling, beating, raping, whatever you can think of doing to a child they were doing. Children were dying up in there. And all they were doing is pushing it under the table because nobody wanted to talk about it. These same people are in existence. They just changed the name, moved to a different place, and they're still under operations. The reason I bring this point up because my investigation was dropped because the Ricky Holland case came in. I know the individuals who investigated that case extremely well. And during that investigation that the state was doing, our Supreme Court Justice, Moore Corrigan, took on $80,000 to put on a commercial campaign to have the people of the state of Michigan call her peers at the Supreme Court and thank them for all she has done for child welfare, foster care, and adoption in the state of Michigan. She had the audacity to run this campaign during the Ricky Holland murder. That was the coldest, maniacal activity I've ever seen in my life. And it was at that point I said, I'm on a mission.